So we're going from having been talking about products contributing into ecosystems. We've also been sharing stories this afternoon from um, uh, traditional organizations playing into ecosystems of ecosystems has been talked about. And so moving from APIs as being the crucial key for unlocking the new age of IoT, to unlocking the potential of embedded platforms. So next up, we're going to hear from someone whose career has been inextricably linked with the success of literally dozens of startups, scale-ups, and product-led platform players. He's been sought out to advise, lecture, lead, and volunteer around all things API product management. He could not be better placed to share lessons from what's happening at the coalface, what works, what doesn't work so well in achieving these big embedded platform goals. I'm delighted to introduce Jeremy Glassenberg, product lead at Docusign. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, Claire. Good to meet you all. Just confirm, can you all hear me?
I can certainly hear you fine, so.
Great. I always like to double check the mic because you never know with these online platforms. All right, well, great to meet you all. Thank you all for coming. As Claire mentioned, we'll be talking today about embedded integration platforms. And I should give a quick summary of what that actually means, since it's not actually an industry
just a moment,
official term.
Oh, sorry, just checking that we could get your slides up. They look absolutely fine.
God, I just assumed those were already working. Are the slides working too then? Forgot to double check that.
All looks, do you want to just check?
Okay. Seems to be up, so I think we're good. All right. Well, to just continue the presentation here. That one moment. All right. So as I mentioned, embedded integration platforms, I should clarify exactly what that means, as it's not an official industry term. In fact, there really is no official term for this product area that I'm talking about. But I hope you all saw the description of the talk before we dive in here. Admittedly, it's not exactly IoT. It may relate to mobile in some ways. I think there's a little bit of Apidays just accommodating time zones for those on the West Coast here in the U.S. But anyways, what we're talking about when I mean when I talk about embedded integration platforms is when you have a platform that allows third-party tools, allows partner products to be integrated into the UI, the interface of your actual product. And we'll get into examples and what exactly that means. But it's an area that's had a lot of success recently, but also a very interesting, very challenging past. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the past and the trends now so that we understand why this space in the world of APIs struggled and what it took to make it successful now. And we're going to talk about that in terms of the product challenges, the technology challenges, and the usability and the design challenges you have to understand in order to make a successful embedded integration platform. Quick intro about me. It's my most hated slide, so go through this quickly. But basically, I've worked on many APIs. I've also worked on many of these embedded platforms and worked with many of these embedded platforms. I've been early at several successful startups, namely Box and Tradeshift. I've worked in education technology and supply chain. I've even worked on drones in the private space industry. So we've tested out these platform strategies in various industries over the course of what's now about 14 years. Yeah, I'm really, really old now. Anywho, I'm currently working at Docusign. I'm part of an API team over there, working on various initiatives within the company and various product teams that are working on APIs here. So basically, I've seen a lot in the world of APIs, and there's one area that I always just love to talk about because it's what really got me excited about joining the world of APIs, even though I'd seen the rise and fall and then return of this concept of the embedded integration framework. So let's talk a little bit about the history of these frameworks. First and foremost, most of us have seen a bit about the general API history, that there is basically this sudden surge in APIs. Going back to around 2009, it was called the API craze, and things really only got crazier since. This is when we really had hyper growth in the world of web APIs, where every company that was on the internet, basically, if they had a web product, they had to suddenly have an API around it. And we saw a lot of success. We also saw many struggles, many failures in APIs during that time, as companies felt that they needed to launch an API, but they didn't exactly have a plan. They didn't exactly know how to design their APIs. Standards weren't really making it just yet. We didn't get to, the open API schema to really help companies adopt REST. And so there was this period of struggle, but we saw that trending growth of APIs and a growth that only continued as standards form, as we figured out more and more what makes for successful APIs. But during that period of struggle and success, certain concepts, certain product areas really were lost in the chaos. And this is one that I love to talk about. I'm going to do a quick show of hands. Just post if you actually remember these platforms that I'm talking about. Just post in chat if you've seen this. The first is just iGoogle. Curious if any of you remember the iGoogle project from Google. It was basically an alternative homepage by Google that allowed you to customize your homepage. You could not just grab some random modules like Google Calendar or Gmail placed on this page, but third parties were creating weather apps, calculator apps, news apps, music apps, and you could install these and then create this custom homepage. Okay, I'm seeing one person. That's usually what I expect. Whenever I give this talk, it's like no more than 3 people remember this thing. Let me ask if you remember a couple of others. LinkedIn, for a while, had a platform whereby partners could become part of the LinkedIn interface. When I worked at Box, we were involved in this. People had the ability to embed a Box folder, or like there's another company that it was basically a Google Slides competitor that allowed you to post presentations online. LinkedIn had a way of letting you connect with one of these products and then customizing your LinkedIn profile with a third-party app. So this was LinkedIn's open social platform. Some of you may remember Facebook when they had an open platform for third parties to be part of the Facebook interface. Those who remember those days back in 2007, you may have gotten many, many messages on Facebook for zombie bites. Your friends were bitten by zombies, and then you got bitten. Usually no more than 3 or 4 people kind of remember any of these 3 platforms. I got to be involved in as a launch partner on some of these. When I was at Box, we were actually a launch partner on LinkedIn. So I got to watch this happen about 13 years ago when this whole platform launched and then quietly shut down. So what happened here? I'm citing 3 companies that generally have been very, very successful in business and in product. But when it came to bringing third parties in their interface, they all had a story of a struggle and actually a failure. There was a lot of this. There was a time when companies were very interested in this type of a platform, and then things just kind of quietly fizzled. Well, at the time, the idea, as we were still kind of figuring out, I guess we were calling it Web 2.0 at the time, it was about making the web act like an operating system. In fact, there's a company that literally did that. They tried to basically make a web page that looked like an operating system. Curious if anyone remembers this. This was a Y Combinator company that it was UOS. And the idea was that you could have this web page that looked like a desktop operating system. You could install apps that are basically just HTML and JavaScript iframed onto a page, but they made it look like just a desktop with a bunch of like JavaScript apps. This thing didn't really pan out either. And the reason is that these ideas, if you look at them, they sound kind of cool, but what's the purpose? What's the value of this sort of a platform? And this is why we had a challenge in this space, really. And unfortunately, at the time, a kind of public challenge, because if an API initiative doesn't work out, okay, you may shut down your developer community. Developers may be affected by it, but there's a lot more potential to restart it because your customers, if your core product is customer facing, your customers might not have exactly seen what was happening. But we're bringing third-party apps into our interface, and then we shut this thing down. That gets some attention. So there was a period where companies were starting to just stay away from this. They didn't see success, and these failures were actually kind of high profile at the time. And companies want to be very quiet. They wanted to just forget what happened, really. But we learned from these mistakes, and we're seeing a trend. And the first thing we've learned is this whole, just because an idea is cool doesn't mean you should just build it and launch it and assume that it's going to work. There's a quote that floats around in Silicon Valley: if you build it, they will come. I'm sure many of you have heard it. And anyone who works in product management or has been at startups that have had their struggles and then success will learn that this is a really bad idea. You don't just build things and assume that people are going to come. This philosophy really doesn't work. In fact, the quote comes from a movie. The movie was Field of Dreams, or if you actually watch the movie, and it's an old enough movie that I can give a spoiler, the people who come are basically the ghosts of these baseball players from the Chicago White Sox, these professional baseball players. These are the ghosts of these players who took a bribe to throw a World Series. They were notorious. So when you think about it, even in the movie where this quote comes from, did they really attract the customers you generally want? In reality, building a successful product involves listening to customers, understanding them, creating value, establishing value points before you actually build a product, and then testing it properly. This is basic product strategy. And if we look back at those embedded frameworks, the most fundamentals of product strategy just weren't really applied. It was more that we got into Web 2.0, wanted to build something cool, and didn't really think about the value point. So what happens if we try this again, thinking about the value points of what kind of apps do we want in our platform that are going to create value for our users, and how should they really interact with our service to provide that kind of experience for our users? When you actually think that through and test things out, you start to see results. Over on Gmail, there are Gmail add-ons. You can bring third-party apps into the Gmail interface. Gmail actually had a few attempts at this, and they figured out how to position this in the right sidebar, how to interact with the compose messages, and create a marketplace of apps that people will actually use. Over at Jira's Trello, we've seen this figured out as well in the world of product management. You can embed apps onto Trello boards and Trello cards. And Trello figured out exactly where these apps should fit in their interface and how they can interact with their interface in a way that generates value for customers. And when we actually then apply product principles, well, now we start to see real results. We're seeing this work at Google, at Slack, at Trello. Shopify has an immense success from a developer platform where they have third parties embedded in their system. But it all comes back to applying product process. So what are the basic learnings on the business and product front? Quite simply, don't just plop the tech where you think it's going to be cool. Don't just open up a part of your app to third parties because you just think it's going to be cool. If you do that, well, you're not really going to be cool. You're basically going to seem more like someone who looked cool in the 80s. And let's face it, the 80s were really weird and awkward. You don't want to be someone who was cool in the 80s. In the end, you have to have real use cases. Work with customers, get feedback, identify real problems that they have, and then from there, figure out what works. In fact, I actually got to talk with product managers, marketers, developers, developer relations folk from several of the successful platforms I listed before, and I learned a lot about their history. Many of these platforms actually didn't launch until they literally saw customers kind of hacking solutions on top of what they had, trying to hack around limitations of their product, injecting code where they weren't supposed to, maybe even violating terms of service. And that's when these customers knew that there was a problem that wasn't solved because customers were demanding it by literally hacking their products to make it work. Which leads to one last important point about having a successful platform. I've seen many of these platforms launch with very few users. If you have very few users, you only are launching this because you have an idea. You don't have that customer feedback. Every single successful platform in this space has had users. They've had a certain saturation point. They have to get to a certain stage of their business before they decide that they're ready to actually launch an embedded integration platform. And they need users for multiple reasons. It's not just about getting customer feedback. This is really going to be an app marketplace. When you have an external API, you don't necessarily need a marketplace. Maybe you're providing a feature benefit to customers and they're just using your APIs for their own products. But when you're bringing third-party apps into your interface, these partners who are building those apps, they're relying on you to market those apps to your customers. So unless you have customers ready to try these apps, you're going to have a dead marketplace. Therefore, it's just vital in order for this platform to be successful to already have a product with customers for which you can test this platform. So I've talked a bit about the business side of things. Now and the product side of things. Now I really want to get into the technology challenge. How do we actually build these platforms? What should be the underlying tech to allow partners to build integrations in your interface? There are various solutions. The most common one and the oldest one and the most controversial one is iframing. Basically, you just let any partner just plop in any HTML, JavaScript, any of their web code right into your web page. The next is cards, which is basically giving you a little bit more control. It limits what the partners can do, but it gives you a little bit more control. And finally, triggers, which is basically just thinking out of the box. What else just kind of makes sense when you think about the flow and the general user experience and where partners can fit in your interface. Let's dive deeper into each of these. First, there's the iframe. Again, that's basically letting anyone just inject code into your site. Once they inject, or basically place their own code on your page. It gives them a lot of freedom. It's the very easy thing to set up. And interestingly, this is still the most common. It's the first technology option that's been around. But I'm sure many of us could see the challenges here. First and foremost, there's security. Even if you have trusted partners, what if your trusted partner gets hacked and the malicious code ends up in that iframed app on your page? But it's not just about security. I can't name names, but I know of several platforms who acknowledged that they actually had a performance issue, that if they allowed on their framework more than one or two third parties to be part of their website, to be displayed on the same page, everything really slowed down. So there were security issues, there were performance issues. I still see many companies actually allow this, and it's not necessarily the end of the world, but we have to give a lot of warnings. This may be the easiest solution, maybe the most open, but yeah, there are a lot of pros and cons here. Going to try going a little bit faster here because I want to make sure we're done by 7:25. I'll note quickly here on the kind of trending technologies, something called cards. This has become unofficially the industry term for it. It's basically saying we're going to have a predefined set of UI items, things that maybe you commonly see in like an HTML form, and we're going to let you use those things for your interface. You're not going to be allowed to have any client-side JavaScript. You can have some server-side code to interact with these cards, but the interface is predefined. What that does is it provides security and performance benefits. You're not letting people put anything onto your web page. It can actually make development easier for partners. In fact, it allows them to more easily build an app that's aligned with your interface, that's consistent in UI because you've predefined what they're allowed to use. And besides the security benefits, the performance benefits, I should note that you will commonly see cards in platforms that have a big mobile play. Because long story short, iframes in mobile apps don't work that well, but cards work very well. You see this in Gmail and Slack. If you build an app, a Gmail add-on or a Slack app, it automatically works in mobile. So there's a big advantage to using cards just from a user experience standpoint, that mobile compatibility. But it comes with this caveat of very limited. There's just a lot less flexibility in what partners can do. And what I've consistently seen were developers who struggle to build an app that really fit well in a card-based platform and choose instead to actually hack around the platform just to make things work. So what else can we do? Well, there are still a lot of trial and error efforts to improve the card experience, but some like Intercom just combine the technology. And I've seen this actually work very, very well, where they say by default, try to use our cards. But if cards just aren't working for you for a legitimate reason, we will let you we will let you use an iframe. Most of the integrations are card-based, and when there's an iframe, it's only when it makes sense. They have to make sure it's mobile compatible. This I've seen generally work well for Intercom, and so I have faith that other companies, if they go this route, it'll work well for them. Finally, on the user experience side of things, what else can we enable besides cards versus iframes? That's the big debate. But I encourage those who are working on a platform like this to think outside the box. Over at Google Drive, it's not just about bringing the app, embedding it in your interface. They allow you to have a little right click on a file and there's a reference to your part to your integration that maybe even opens up a new window. Over in Google Drive, I can right click on an image and have it, edit it, have it open up an image editor. So it becomes editable in a third-party image editor. Or hey, I can go and right click on a file and have it sent to Docusign. And there isn't an iframe integration here. It's just a logo and some text saying, hey, the partner integration is here. So if you think outside the box, you can do things like this. Google Docs is a way of customizing their menu as well. There's no iframing here. There's no cards. It's just getting creative with what makes sense with your interface. Now, we've talked a lot about the usability and product aspects here, and especially when it comes to the user experience. iframe and cards, a little bit of it is security. A lot of it is about what makes sense for your users. But how do we make it as easy as possible to build these apps and to enable partners to build these integrations as best as possible? I'd like to talk a little bit about the tech behind the developer experience too. Let's go through this very quickly here. One I'll just note is, for any embedded platform, assume there are going to be corresponding APIs. Many of these are just, we let you iframe in and we give you access to our APIs. And when we load your app in an iframe, we automatically give you an access token so you can call our APIs. One level above that is to think, how can this app, if it's securely iframed in or integrated through cards and restricted in one area of my interface, what if we can let it interact through API calls with some other parts of our UI? In Google Docs, we let you create programmatically a custom menu item. This is done by creating APIs that are meant just for your embedded framework. API calls that can update the interface, the page where these apps are embedded. So first, let's go into APIs. Next, if we have APIs, and this is all running mostly client side, many of your partners should just interact with these APIs through JavaScript. Let's create a library, a JavaScript library, to make it easier to interact with these APIs. And once you get there to having the JavaScript library, you realize that many of your partners are just integrating with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. In other words, it's all client-side code, and maybe your platform can actually host the code itself. There are platforms that host server-side code as well, and often we have to do that. We can't allow partners to actually interact exclusively with client-side code. I once worked in an education tech company where if we let these partners, it was actually for K-12 education, and these were student-facing apps. So it could be like a math app or a crossword app that would actually, after the student interacted with the app, submit a grade to a grade book. So if we allowed everything to happen client side, you may have someone taking like a crossword app who's not very good at English, but is very good at computers and may figure out how the app is making an API call to submit a grade to the grade book. So we had to make sure that API calls were in fact on server side. But sometimes if you can allow the integration to happen entirely client side, it's fairly easy to host the code yourself on behalf of your partners. All right, so the one last bit for the UI I note is going beyond the libraries. Think about what are common ways that customers are going to embed. If you're iframing and you're not doing cards, just think like what kind of common interfaces may make sense in your experience, and enable those for your partners by pre-building those as something that developers can just load in their own app. It makes for a very consistent user experience, and it makes it much easier for developers and partners to build a user experience. I will note there are many caveats to security in terms of iframing. There are some things you can do to restrict what people can do within an iframe, but I also emphasize, think about the authentication scope. If a partner is embedded in your framework, make sure they don't have access to everything in the user's account. Like for Google Drive, if I'm right-clicking on a file and editing in an image editor, Google Drive says today that they have a special scope for this that says that the partner only has access to that one file that I'm sending, not access to everything in my Google Drive account. I've seen platforms when they first launched not take security like that into consideration. It's not just about secure APIs, it's really thinking through the design. All right, so we're at the 25-minute mark. I have to wrap it up. I think you started maybe a little late, but thank you all for putting up with me for 25 minutes. Emphasize a lot of what we're seeing here. It's experimentation. We're seeing success only in recent years. So there's no standard here. And so I hope that you all, if you get interested in this space, see what others are doing, learn from what others are doing, but try and fail and experiment with different ideas here, because we're still learning, we're still figuring out what really works best for these embedded frameworks. And with that, we'll continue to grow the market and bring back the embedded integration framework. Thank you again for your time. Do we have time for any questions?
We're actually pretty much at time, Jeremy. Although we are probably going to need to close out quickly. But look, do stay on just to make sure that I get a chance to really thank you for insights, which I think will be really valuable for designers and engineers that are facing into some product owners facing into some of these big questions. So thank you very much for joining us. I know it's still kind of early in the morning with you. We look forward to hopefully having you back again at an API Days conference in the not too distant.